We are still having some people joining us, but I think we'll get started. It's great to see that so many people have registered for this event. We're very, very excited to welcome you. My name is Beth Eggleston from Humanitarian Advisory Group. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight. For me, that's the Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, which is in the Macedon Ranges. This acknowledgement could not be more relevant to the discussion that we're going to be having tonight. And although we might be speaking about international issues and contexts, I think it's really important that we remember how critically relevant these issues are right here in Australia. So who is Humanitarian Advisory Group? We're a social enterprise based here in Melbourne, and we focus on primarily the international humanitarian sector, but we have a team who have also worked extensively in long-term development. We have had a partnership with the University of Melbourne, the Masters of Development Studies program, over the last 5 or 6 years. And it's been really exciting to connect students and practitioners and have relevant discussions. So in introducing this topic, we had a long discussion actually, or even around what we should call this event tonight. So inequality of aid is something that we're extremely passionate about. And we're going to be looking at issues both in the humanitarian response sphere, but also in the long-term structural development side of things tonight. I mean, language is really important. At Humanitarian Advisory Group, we're even talking about, words like, minority, capacity development, white savior ideology. There are all these concepts and linguistic complexities that we've been discussing about what they mean and how do they impact the work that we do. I mean, it could be the difference between how national and international staff are treated in employment policies and aid agencies, how knowledge is produced, owned, used, the power dynamics around decision-making, and confronting the reality that the sector is steeped in structural racism. So if we look at some of the statistics, so 2% of donor funding goes to local humanitarian organisations, still, even with all the global commitments that have been made. And we're seeing the emergence of really important organisations such as the NEAR Network, the Network for Empowered Aid Response, and ADESO, and many others that are having a great impact and elevating the voices that have not been heard in many around the tables of power. So maybe some of the students are asking yourselves, hang on, I chose development studies to be part of the solution. Are you saying I'm part of the problem? Don't worry, I've been there too. I was sitting doing the very same degree many years ago. And we're not going to say that tonight you're going to get all the answers, but we are going to have a really exciting discussion. And this is a very timely discussion. Even just this week, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, released one of their reports looking at and confronting the institutional racism within MSF, calling for a clear roadmap for a radical reimagination of their approach to humanitarian work. And there's been a lot of soul searching, I think, within the sector. But of course, soul searching is not enough. And that's where I'm excited to introduce to you the moderator of tonight's session, Dr. Chrisanta Muli, who I met 12 years ago. Chrysanthe, yes, it's been that long. And I've been inspired by her passion, intelligence, and wit ever since. So Chrysanthe has begged me not to give a long bio, but I mean, she has a wealth of experience, more than 15 years on many continents. She's worked in monitoring and evaluation. She's worked in research with a range of different aid organisations, including Oxfam, the Red Cross, International Women's Development Agency. She's also worked with a whole range of universities, including the University of Melbourne. She's very passionate about gender justice and in particular, women and girls' rights, in particular around equal opportunity and access to education. I love that Chrysanthe has left off her bio that she has a PhD and many other achievements, but I'm going to hand over to her and she can explain a little more about that, as well as why she's wearing a school uniform or tunic tonight. Welcome, Chrysanthe.
Thank you very much, Beth, and welcome everybody. It is certainly a pleasure for me to be here. I'm so honored. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which I stand on today, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I do pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Yes, there's so many things you've already said, Beth, that I want to jump into, but I'm going to not go there. But the only thing I'm going to talk about for now is the dress. Yes, I am wearing a school dress. Somebody called it a tunic. Wasn't sure about that language, but hey, it's a dress. And I've been wearing it for the last 30 days. I will be wearing it for an additional 30 days. I am supporting Onegirl and the organization that I work with and for, that is focused mainly on harnessing the power of education to break down the barriers of inequality that women and girls continue to face today. Over 130 million girls, it's going to be 150 million by the end of this year, girls do not have access to education. So why, Chrisanta, are you wearing the dress? I'm wearing a dress because I am raising awareness and I'm also fundraising, but I'm raising awareness to remind myself as well of the symbol of what this dress means. As I mentioned, millions of girls don't have access to education due to social, cultural, economic, political, environmental issues, but inequality is really reigning in that sort of space. And this is also a symbol that girls' education is a right. It is not a privilege. It is not something we should still be talking about. And I always challenge by asking the question, why don't we talk about boys and education? For more information on Do It in a Dress, www.doitinaddress.com, and I will be sharing more details as we go along. But that is not why we're here. We're here to talk about other issues of inequality, because inequality is sort of something that we continue to challenge, we continue to ask questions about. For me as an African woman, inequality, racism, discrimination, the lot, has been an aspect that, you know, follows me and has followed many women and many African women or many women of color around the world. So today we are so honored, may I say, to have 4 fabulous panelists with us today who will be sharing their diverse skills, experience, perspectives, and thoughts on inequality, specifically in the aid sector as well as in the humanitarian sector. And the first person I'll be introducing is Pamela Cambinido. She's a researcher and consultant in the Philippines with over 7 years of experience in applied social research, specifically looking at humanitarian response research. Pamela will be drawing on her experience to share her perspective with us today. Welcome, Pamela, and wave to the good people so they can see you. Our next amazing panelist is Rohan Kent. Rohan is a program manager at International SOS and has extensive experience in the humanitarian sector in various positions, frontline, in admin, and has literally been deployed to several sudden onset and protracted disasters in Africa and in Asia. Rohan is currently managing the COVID-19 vaccination rollout in his current role. So welcome, Rohan. We are excited that you are here with us today. Then we have Bethia Burgess, a PhD candidate and a social researcher. She is currently completing her PhD, and her research is exploring how ethnic community-based activists think about and work towards justice in Myanmar. She'll be also drawing on her experience. We welcome you, Bethia. And last but certainly not least, we have Suman Asano Islam. He's an advisor and is based in Bangladesh, right? Suman has over 25 years experience in all major disasters, basically in Bangladesh, and has been involved in strategic leadership, design, implementation, monitoring, and emergency response programs. We are so excited that you're here with us, Suman. You are welcome. So, without much further ado, we've done the introductions. We know who's who in the zoo today, and we know where they're coming from. This panel discussion is going to go something like this. We're not going to do presentations. What we are going to do is I'm just going to throw out some questions to start the conversation with our amazing panelists. And of course, if you have any questions, don't be shy to put them on in the chat space, and I will try as much as possible to sort of reach out to them. We'll have a session right at the end of this panel discussion where we can get into more details with questions. But if anything is burning, let us know about it, and we'll be happy to respond. So, without much further ado, let's open this discussion and hear from our fabulous, amazing panelists. Suman, I'm going to start with you. I would like to hear from you, what do we really mean when we talk about equitable humanitarian sector? What does that mean? What does that look like for you? Suman, can you hear me?
Yes,
sorry.
I was facing some technical network difficulties. So
okay, no, take your
time. Okay, so can you tell me the question? What even I've lost some.
Yeah. So the question is, what do we mean when we're talking about equitable humanitarian sector? What are we really talking about here?
When we say some sector, let me tell my experience. Just last 4 days, I have been training around 25 very grassroots level volunteers in Cox's Bazar who will be providing child protection, gender-based violence awareness and training for the adolescent girls. And I have been interacting with all those 25 volunteers very closely over the last 4 days. And also for over the last 3 years, I directly provide training around like 800 local humanitarian aid workers in Cox's Bazar. So when we say as a sector, humanitarian aid work as a sector, it is actually a very new emerging sector. It's not only as a sector, but as a academic discourse, as a professional discourse. And everybody now acknowledge that, yes, everyone can do some work on the sector, but some people do it professionally. As this is not a rocket science, so everybody can do it, but some people do it professionally. And when it is the question of life, is the question of rights, it should be professional. And for that perspective, we know that this core humanitarian standard alliance coming up with this professional competency of the humanitarian aid workers. And all those things are actually providing is the importance of establishing the core principles of humanitarian aid, which you know there's impartiality, independent, need-based, and humanity, etc. All these are theoretically, as we can see from the very beginning of the humanitarian aid sector, are talking about the establishing the equality for everyone. And when we talk equality, as a social scientist, you know that even I am very much conscious and sensitive. I build up in a society that give me some kind of social construction, understanding, and some kind of thought that even I'm very much cautious, I behave like some inequality behavior. So, you know, those are the behavior. For that purpose, it is important people who work in this sector need some those professional competencies and the leadership to make the response, humanitarian response, humanitarian aid work equitable. It is not like that someone, we give someone a briefing and he or she will go out there in the camps and become very professional and equitable behavior they will make. So it is important people build up competencies, practices over normal time, quote unquote, normal time, and then during the response time, they behave equitable response. So this is one part of the humanitarian aid work. The other part is, if you say this, the people who were affected by the crisis, their kind of the vulnerability is highly increased because of the inequitable behavior or inequitable society. Well, in fact, the crises themselves are made by those inequitable behavior. If we got into the in depth kind of dig out the real reason or real cause of a humanitarian crisis, it is coming from the inequitable society, inequitable behavior from the political or social vulnerability. Well, you can say when it is a cyclone, how the inequitability make it vulnerable people. Well, when people face the inequality, they are the most vulnerable. The poor, the women, the marginalized groups, they are facing already face like 100 times more vulnerability than a so-called mainstream society. Then when this cyclone or flood hit, they are the first, if you say quote unquote, victim of those crises. So I'm conclude for now that this inequality, if we say, is the real cause or the root cause of disaster and humanitarian crisis, the root cause of it. So there are, and to address it at the phase when people are very much vulnerable, it needs special competencies and professionalism from the aid sector. So yeah. I'll be waiting for next question and time, and let's.
Thank you, Suman. That really starts to set up the discussion around, and I like the way you're looking at inequality in terms of really being a root cause of some of the disasters we see. Inequality is also the root cause of some of the poverty we see. So I like the way you're making that connection. Bethia, I have a question for you. And this is really looking at the aid sector and the premise in which it is built. So I would like to understand from you, what are some of the assumptions that the aid sector is built on, and what impact does this have in terms of how we therefore operate as a sector?
Thank you for the question, Chrisanta, and hi everyone. I'm coming to you from Nam, otherwise known as Melbourne, and I'm really excited to join this conversation. I think on that question, I won't go too much into the assumptions that you learn about. Suman's already mentioned some of the principles of humanitarianism, but some of the discussions that I think have been becoming more and more mainstream, not just in the aid sector, but in our lives, with different social movements, are those kinds of ideas about the kind of north-south or majority world, minority world assumptions of knowledge, where knowledge sits, and also where power sits, and how that is and isn't recognised. So in my experience has been predominantly working with grassroots ethnic communities, a lot of young people and women. So that's kind of the experiences of those organisations, as well as my experience being a a development practitioner for a Western donor organisation. So just to be transparent about where I'm coming from, and obviously I've got the, I'm doing research, so I've got a particular point of view about what those assumptions are. To me, the two biggest ones I think that might be interesting for us to talk about today are this idea that in the developing, so-called developing or underdeveloped countries, there's a deficiency. So donors are coming in to fill a need, and there's a lot of assumptions, I think, that often get built into that around where the expertise is and who knows what is best for communities. So it's not just a deficiency of resources that's assumed, but it's a deficiency in, it's a paternalism. It's a deficiency in understanding what needs to be done and what will improve people's lives. And the other thing I think, which is, I guess, more of an economic thing, is that scarcity assumption. And I think that's a really tricky one to get to the bottom of, because it's part of, and all of these issues are part of our lives in many ways, but being built for the most part on capitalist systems, we come into, this work and we think, oh, we have, $20 million budget for this organisation, and these are the projects that we can fund, and this is the amount of time that we can fund them for. And so you're coming in with a finite amount, and you're coming at a problem that is far bigger than the money that you have to do anything with, and you create competition, you create a kind of oppression Olympics sort of situation where people are having to pit themselves against their fellow communities to try and advocate for why they deserve that money more than others. And I won't go on for too long, but I think we can talk about this more, about the ideas of like that coloniality of thinking, and very much like I don't want to be using that as a buzzword, because I think that's another, there's so many problems, but I think the problem can also be that we find an issue and we come up with a buzzword and we say we're tackling it because we're doing something with that buzzword in the title, or we hire a consultant, or we have, more like I can be a poster girl for a Western development organisation. I don't have any expertise from a global South country because I was born in Australia, but those are the kinds of things that I think those murky areas are really important to sit in, and that discomfort of being a settler, of being complicit in other people's oppression just by the virtue of living. I think they're really uncomfortable, but it's good to see that those conversations are starting to come out, so we can really think about what a more equitable aid system, what a more equitable world could look like. So I hope I didn't go on too long, but thank you, and happy to keep chatting about it.
Absolutely. You've raised some really interesting points that start to open Pandora's box in terms of, the notion of language even. I remember a famous writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I think, he mentioned something that language carries the entity and a body of values. So when we use these words, there are values and that are attached to them, and the perception that comes out of it. So I think it's really important for us to be careful sometimes about how we've overused some of these words: colonial, decolonial, neo-colonial, all those words, globalization. But there is a bigger discussion about how those words then are transformed into the practice of the way in which them versus us sort of operate. I'm curious to understand, Rohan, this is a question for you. What are some of the assumptions that are, in the humanitarian sector? What are these assumptions built on in the humanitarian sector, and what impact do they have on how you operate? I think what Bethia had said was really great from an aid sector perspective, but let's start to look down and really narrow down into that humanitarian sector.
Sure, and I'd just like to also, before I start, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm sitting, the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. So I think it's a really interesting question, and being out on the periphery, I guess, of the aid sector, the humanitarian sector now for a few months or a couple of years almost. It's interesting looking back on some of the actions I took as an expatriate aid worker in many countries. And I think, everything from funding through to our interaction with our local staff on the ground is quite eye-opening, looking backward in hindsight. I remember during the Rohingya response in Bangladesh, there was literally a divide in the room in our small office there, with the expatriates came in and started sort of barking orders, and then the local national staff were there. So it was really apparent, and you could feel the tension literally in this small room as we started to ramp up. Yet, walking through the camps, the locals would approach me as opposed to my other, more Anglo expat colleagues. So, just that sort of being in it and knowing you're part of it, I think, as others have touched on, is really quite interesting. So I think one of the things is touched on is the assumptions is that the money going in to all these agencies who do the same thing, when we know in the sector there's a lot of agencies. And I think the beauty of the sector is if you look hard enough, there's the opportunity for partnership. One of the assumptions, though, I think we make on the negative is that when we're partnering, we don't often think deeply and from a longevity sense about local partners. We're often held to funding cycles in the West. And this is a challenge for us, because we have to sustain funding and we have to build up capability and capacity of local partners. But a lot of those partnerships are actually hidden really behind a contract, and it's really subcontracting. So that's one, I think, the trickle down effect of that is obviously you're not necessarily passing on the skills that you need. You're tied to a Western contract or a donor contract. And you're basically it's a servient master sort of relationship. So that's one. I think one of the other things I've noticed really, the assumption is that that faith-based agencies cannot be neutral. And I'd probably be guilty of it myself as we ran the flagpole. The flag up the flagpole saying that my agency was this, that, and the other, this agency is they're really focused on providing aid, but with a religious take. And I think that's really worrying, actually. And looking back on it and looking at myself, having that view as a young aid worker, I think you've really got to understand the International Red Cross, Red Crescent Code of Conduct, that's absolutely not allowed, and it excludes any form of discrimination in humanitarian work, which in effect promotes equality and equity on the ground. So I think it ties in nicely there. And I think the last thing I'd point to, looking back at it, was that if the question I often got when I came home is why are we donating to you guys anyway? The problem's still there. The issue is never going to go away. The people in that country are not supporting themselves, when in fact, when again you dig down into it, the political considerations of many countries and many disasters are actually the root cause of some of the problems. And I think and political will is not equitable in many countries. It's not providing as the duty bearer to the rights holder. It's not equitable. And there's political, economic, social reasons often why. So I think, it's been quite interesting in hindsight, looking back on my career as a young humanitarian, and having some of those assumptions and realizing that I needed to probably grow up a lot quicker whilst I was in the field.
Thanks, Rohan. Reflection indeed. I too have had my moments of reflection whilst in the organizations and pulling my hair out. But I think some of what you've raised around, Western impositions on how, humanity, how to address problems, especially when excluding the people who are experiencing the problems. Having these conversations in Melbourne, and then we go and we're like, yes, we now have a plan and a program, and we're going to, we're going to manage this. But there's also this other question that sort of has been alluded to, which is, national versus international staff, and the divide, which you very well, very beautifully put, the divide around, how you should behave and what the implications are if you are not an international staff member, that then, is going to, is going to adhere to the norms. So there's this, if you're a national staff member, you need to learn the norms as far as how we do business in this organization that is based over there. And also, if you don't behave in that way, then your career trajectory is sort of curtailed. I have seen it, I have experienced it in many ways. So there's a lot of that you've raised, Rohan, and I think it's really important for us to really think about what we are saying when we talk about, this words like decolonize. It's not as simple as switch off and switch on. It's a whole mindset. I have a question for Pam. And Pam, my question is really around opening this up a little bit. How does inequality in the humanitarian sector actually play out? And how does it affect, communities, local humanitarian workers? What does it look like on the ground?
Thank you for your question, Chrisanta. I'm also excited to hear the perspectives of everyone in this discussion. So, of course, there's a lot to say here, and there have been a lot that's been said by the other panelists. And I think just to give structure to my answer, I'll draw on some of the research works that we've done with Humanitarian Sector, and also during the Typhoon Haiyan response here in the Philippines. For those who are not familiar, Typhoon Haiyan happened almost, it's about 9 years ago, and Typhoon Haiyan was said to be one of the strongest typhoon to make landfall in recent history, which have killed around, in the official government statistics, it's around 7,000, but displaced more than 4 million people. So I was part of a research project that examined the effectiveness of communication technology in bridging the gap between humanitarian NGOs and affected communities during the Typhoon Haiyan response. And that was one of the moments that I've observed how inequality can manifest and how it can affect the local communities and humanitarian workers themselves. So when you think about accountability, you think about social media platforms, you think about SMS, you think about having texting and call platforms or those face-to-face appeals. But what struck us during that time is that narrow sense or that narrow definition of accountability fails to see that there's actual people collecting, organizing this feedback. There are people who are making sure that all the feedback from the communities are neatly categorized in an Excel sheet. And some of these people that were hired to do this work were actually part of the disaster affected populations themselves. They were very young, they just recently graduated, and they were very hopeful for their prospects ahead, but then Typhoon Haiyan happened. So what was interesting there is that despite the local humanitarian workers' proximity to and knowledge of local communities' needs and priorities, they felt they were very marginalized. They were unable to exert influence in the projects that they handle because of their short-term contracts, because of issues of funding and leadership style. And they felt for the most part that these technologies that we are importing from which countries whatever countries they come from, are actually imposed rather than co-designed by local actors themselves. So these inequalities that played out actually have very large implications with the relationship with the communities. For the local humanitarian workers that we've had a chance to talk to, they felt a sense of disillusionment and burnout because they saw that large disconnect between what communities actually need and what NGOs provide. and it was very hard because their work revolved around ensuring that these feedback really get to the NGOs, ensuring that changes can happen, ensuring that certain communities receive a certain kind of assistance. But when they raised these concerns with a list of solutions, they were not listened to. For the communities, what was disheartening is the breakdown of trust, because for them, and what they're arguing is that why should we trust you when you repeatedly ignore our feedback? Why should we trust you when you can also listen to the colleagues that you're working with? So it was very clear that there was a great disparity of power, and it has really implications to the way we work with the communities who are affected by crises and disasters. So the Typhoon Haiyan was really a major turning point for humanitarian NGOs in the Philippines. And the story I told you was something so familiar with many local NGOs that they wanted things to get better. It's not enough that they are in the passenger seat during a disaster or crisis. And I saw that there's a strong movement and demand for localization to be taken really seriously here. Of course, not only in the Philippines, but among Southern NGOs. And in recent years, there have been initiatives to translate this into this rhetoric to practice, and this meant pioneering support and supporting locally led funding mechanisms where local NGOs are given priority and are given access to funding for them to be able to respond effectively. And also this meant getting representation and voice in important humanitarian networks, such as the Humanitarian Country Team. It also meant those innovative initiatives where now we have a database of not all, but local responders and with different expertise such as WASH, livelihood, shelter, and looking at this before relying to international experts. And of course, things are starting to change here, and mainstreaming this will require really a strong movement to transform those so-called unequal relationships. To what extent this would look like is something that I think we'll still unpack in this discussion. But I think one thing is for sure here, we cannot do this without reflecting on our own positions of power and privilege, and reflecting on how it affects our decisions and actions that we make. And of course, this would require an uncomfortable look inside, which can also be difficult.
That's so great. So many points raised, Pam, and I agree with all of that. How can you be a passenger in a process that is affecting you directly? How can others come and impose that which they think we need when we are the ones in that lived experience? And I hear you loud and clear. Breakdown of trust in communities. And when I use the word community, I'm being very careful. It's women, girls, men, boys, people of all ages are affected, but they are people in their space. And what we forget is you have to build trust to be able to be part of and to be able to engage in the community. I thank you for that really well thought through points, Pamela, and really getting us to the people. This can be quite theoretical. Now you're getting us to how does this sort of impact on others. Suman, you have been quiet for too long. I have a question for you. And this is really about you sharing some findings on some work on a project that you did where you were looking at staff skills in the Cox. Is that the Cox Plaza in the Rohingya response?
Yes, that's
yes.
the Cox in the
Great.
Rohingya.
Yes. So we'd love for you to bring some of what Pamela is talking about and to sort of bring us back to the real, the nitty-gritty, not the theoretical.
Right. Well, I myself spent of all my career as a humanitarian aid worker, local humanitarian aid worker, dealing with experts in various crisis situations. And throughout not only my experience, but also did this study, learning need assessment back in 2019 in Cox's Bazar, directly interacting around 450 local humanitarian aid workers in Cox's Bazar. Well, any humanitarian crisis situation, the first thing any organization need is the staff. Overnight, I know some organization in Cox's Bazar, over a week, they recruited 2,500 staff and volunteers. Can you imagine? Just only within a week, they recruited 2,500 local staff. And who are those? They're just straight coming out from college, schools, or teachers, or leaving their sales job, or joining as a humanitarian aid worker in the crisis, providing and helping people. I say helping people who need the most important support from those organizations. So you can now see that what it can be. I'm not having any word, but you can understand what it can be happen after that. When organization recruited around 14,000 Bangladeshi staff, mostly who have been working in the other part of the country, doing microcredits or some school education, non-formal programs or livelihood programs, putting them overnight with a direction or with a directive, I would say, that you are assigned to go to Cox's Bazar in this crisis situation. And in one side, they have no experience. On the other side, the crisis, the emotional part of it, the physical labor of it, the problem of residing their own food, own stay, nobody actually care about it, particularly for the local organization. International organization staff, they're coming, and sometimes I say the humanitarian crisis in Cox's Bazar is a 5-star luxury humanitarian crisis. People come here from outside, international staff come here, and it's a tourist place. There are a number of very good quality hotels. They stay there, and they just direct and guide. I see to those local staff, and local staff are the people who actually, it is a hilly part of the country. Rohan, you visited there. It is a hilly part of the country, and you know that from one hill to another hill, every day, some local staff have to like 8, 10, 9 times just go up and come down. So with this physical, plus seeing the vulnerability and the sufferings of the people, the emotional part, then added with no briefing, no guideline, just instruction-led, I would say instruction-led activities, doing instruction-led activities. So seeing all these things, I actually propose with, again, Save the Children, UK, and BRAC, and university in Bangladesh Professional University of Professional, and I was with the Humanitarian Leadership Academy then. So we all together came in and take this study and find, as you can imagine, what would be the findings. Very few people been provided about any kind of the basic kind of the competencies of basic idea about the humanitarian response, and still there is nothing. All organizations, they do the subcontracting, giving the competitive bidding process. Local organization, even international organization, have to show that we have all the capacity with our staff and everything. You just give money, we'll implement it. And there is no budget, no activity, nothing around the capacity building of local staff. I can say sporadically one or other organization, they are just giving some technical, how to do kind of the trainings. And again, those quality of these trainings, result of the trainings can be questioned. So how to do this technical, apart from how to do these technical trainings, no, very few people got those very essential, basic humanitarian competency-based trainings. For example, core humanitarian standards, fair standards, inclusive response, psychosocial training, psychosocial well-being, code of conduct, those kind of things. So when I go there and start doing some kind of the training with those people, as I said earlier, that I provided training around by now it's around 1,000 directly to those staff. I see how blank look they provide when we talk about those trainings and competencies. And I'm not giving you any figures, although the study we got percentage numbers and figures. I'm not getting into that numbers, but the core finding of those, and donors, UN organization, international organization, nobody is really considering those professionalism of humanitarian aid work in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar area. And what is the result of it? The results now, when this the emergency level is lowering down, all expatriate is just leaving Cox's Bazar. Now, who is gonna implement the rest of the support with or leading the rest of the project or rest of the support in the Cox's Bazar? Again, coming back to those Bangladeshi or the local aid workers who are just struggling, even writing a report with the language that in a professional in a language and terms that could be shareable with the bigger professional arena.
Yeah.
So and when it comes at the localization thing, it is again organization, the Bangladeshi organization who are working in Cox's Bazar, mainly they are expert on microcredit. So on other day, I was visiting some organization, and there the leaders, the managers been complaining they have very less competitive staff and everything. And I was saying that when you implement a humanitarian program with the microcredit staff, it will happen like this.
Yes,
there is no alternative. This is the result.
Yeah.
So it is important when we think that for a equitable or efficient humanitarian response, professionalism is important. Investing on the people who will deliver it. You can give me a lot of money, but if I don't have the competency of delivering it, all your investment is on the way or is a loss. So it is very important by whom we are delivering to the vulnerable people. And those are the local aid workers.
Yes.
And they are the real kind of the local capacity. So, and which is very much ignored in the discussion of localization.
True. Yeah. Thank you, Suman. I'll hold you there. I know there's more to say. I'm conscious that Rohan has something to say, and but I appreciate what you've said. 2,500 local staff being hired overnight, and then you expect impact and change. Really, without the training, is quite scary. But Rohan, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to I guess follow on from what Suman was saying, because I think one of the challenges that the sector faces, and I got picked up on it just about 10 minutes ago in the chat about my language, and I think it's absolutely correct. And I think, you know, NGOs especially would hire on the basis of technical expertise, whereas we should be really thinking about contextual expertise as well. So whether this is part of the transformative approach that we should be adopting is not just looking at the degrees of someone that they've got from various universities and institutions. But like you were saying, Suman, someone that knows the context of that part of Bangladesh is possibly quite, just as valuable and should be treated just as meaningfully as someone coming in with multitudes of degrees. So I think language and the perception of language is absolutely vital and underpinning a lot of this, and whether this is needs to be more into the transformative approach that we should be adopting. I think is something that we should be thinking about. So.
Thank you for reiterating language. I found my little quote. Language carries the entire body of values by which we come to perceive ourselves and our place in our world. And that is so important and so critical, especially in the international development sector, where we are looking at multiple cultures, multiple diversities, intersectionalities. It's so many different people, and how we use those words sometimes does have an impact in terms of how we're understood. Bethia, you've been very quiet, and I'd like to bring you into this conversation. Maybe you can start by sharing, what your overall thoughts are, if there's anything that's jumped up. But also, I'd like to hear, just a little bit about, what you think are some of the practices that are either supporting or hindering this equitable aid in the sector that we are in. What is stopping us? We've talked about localization, and somebody the other day said to me, if really we were serious about localization, what is stopping the capacity from being strengthened and being enhanced? What is stopping people from being able to do that? We've been talking about localization for decades, and we're still localizing. What are we doing? So anyway, I'd like to hear your thoughts, Bethia. Take this wherever you want to go with it for now.
Thank you, Chrisanta. And I would love to, I just want to respond to some of the really interesting questions that have come up in the chat first, if that's okay, or issues that have come up. So one of them that I really, just like it reminded me of something that I didn't say before, it was from Sanjukta. Talk about, I'm working on a manual on how to decolonize M&E with a great group of researchers and would love your perspectives. And I just thought this might be something that others have something to say about, but from my experience of doing monitoring and evaluation and designing, trying to collaboratively design what these tools were trying to measure and how you could understand what, change was a result of your program being implemented. I think a lot of the issues that I still found really disconcerting was that however we were framing that M&E model to look like it was, whether you say decolonized or locally led or, any kind of that sort of frame, the accountability that M&E framework is being created for is to be accountable to the donor and to be accountable to the donor's donor, and to be accountable to the country that, whether it's USAID or for Australia, we have DFAT accountability, aspects that we have to then put onto our partners or the recipients of the money. So I think, I didn't want to talk too much about what a more equitable aid system, what we mean when we talk about that, because I think that's a conversation to be led by people who are, in those positions where they're receiving aid funding at the moment. But to me, looking at the communities that have spoken to me about this issue, it's about a system that is accountable to the communities rather than a system that is accountable to the donors. And a few things that I think came up when Suman and Rohan were talking that I just sort of jotted down was the idea, first of all, that we need to really be much more critical about the ways in which language is being used. So just talking about local, workers, someone in the comments, wrote, a lot of the time when local people are hired, it is people from elite, families or from the cities or, people who speak English. Speaking English is or speaking, the language of the donor is the #1 barrier to, an equitable distribution of aid, because that's a huge assumption that, you know, somehow that people have to be working on the terms of, you know, the donor, and that's often not the people who, you know, could really be benefiting the most. And that's, I think, why we see, you know, so many questions. Why isn't, you know, extreme poverty, why is that not going anywhere? Why are we not doing anything about, you know, the rising inequity globally, and seeing these issues as, you know, someone else has mentioned, as issues in the field, rather than issues that we're all grappling with in all of our societies, and they're really coming to the fore with COVID, with, you know, other financial crises that have happened in so-called developed countries. I think we really need to look at ourselves as being able to learn from countries that have gone through, you know, they've gone through colonization, they've gone through extreme, you know, conflict-based that's arisen as a result of very improper decolonial practices. They've got a lot of knowledge and experience, but because it's not in English and it's not accessible to us, we won't see it as useful. And I think we have to be really hard on ourselves and really, you know, like not just say the nice things like, oh, let's partner with people and let's localize things. And that's why localization doesn't go anywhere, because we don't want to, you know, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, I won't go on too much about academic stuff, but they're two, the article that they wrote in 2012, Decolonization is not a metaphor, I think is really pertinent to this conversation. You know, there's scholars who've written a lot on the topic, but I just love that it's a very short, easy to read article, and I can write it in the chat so people can find it if you don't know it. But you know, they talk about all of these issues of what happens when you use decolonization as a metaphor, and how it actually prevents us from doing the work that really is meant by decolonization. So that was a bit of a tangent. And then the other thing I just wanted to say about Suman saying, you know, that we're seeing you investing, and if you're investing your money, but you're not, you know, training, or you're not doing the capacity building, then that's a lost investment. And I think that's another really interesting terminology choice, right? We talk about investment, we talk about economic growth. We have a language of very much a business model, which then we refute because we say, no, we're you know, benevolent, we're coming in here and saving the poor people. And what we could see if we don't call it aid, what if we, you know, looked at it as reparations? What if we looked at it as, you know, redistributing money in a way that isn't creating our role as the white saviors, or the, in my case, brown saviors, but, you know, coming it from that way, I think seeing it less as, you know, something that we hold the resources and you have to be accountable to us and we're investing in this. You know, I just think that that's a really interesting kind of thing to unpack. I'm going to stop there because I'm rambling, but I'm just getting really excited. So don't mind me.
So many amazing points. Now you have me thinking decolonization and soft power and colonial power, and where is this coming from? So please don't apologize for sharing with us. I think it's really important that we really start to call these things what they are and how they are understood, because in that language, we can start to unpack the power dynamics within it. So I think it's really important for us to not necessarily be shy to name these things as we have learned them or seen them, so that we can unpack them. Otherwise, they end up being that thing that's in our back pocket that we only use every so often. But I think decolonization is important for us to talk about. And I was reading an article somewhere where they said decolonization should be an act that's not seen first of all, decolonization is not seen equally by those who advocate for it. It ranges for reforming the system to throwing it all out and starting again. And so it's not a specific sort of way. It creates a whole other dimension in terms of what we need to do. Now, Pam, I have a question for you. And this one is around how can we how can diversity and inclusion start to support the achievement or help the achievement of more equitable, ways of working in the humanitarian sector, or a more equitable humanitarian sector?
Thanks again, Chrisanta. And this is something that I'm really excited to talk about, because this is what we've been working on in the past 12 months with PEEP and Humanitarian Advisory Group. And we have yet to publish the findings of this report, but I'm very happy to give like a sneak peek of what we have learned so far on how diversity and inclusion can actually help us in like getting or doing some progress in terms of achieving a more equitable humanitarian sector. So of course, when you talk about diverse and inclusive teams, those are teams that include people from a broad range of different backgrounds and perspectives, and as well as giving space and time for their contributions. Of course, the ethics of diversity and inclusion are uncontested, and there is a lot of talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion in the sector. But what we found is that, of course, that's important, but there's also a lot of work to do in ensuring that these values actually reflect on the sector's work and practices. So before that, let me share with you some of the statistics from HAG's data on diversity, just to give you like a more concrete picture of what we're talking about. In terms of the composition of those leadership teams in the sector, only 4% are filled by persons with disability. 69% of the most senior leadership roles in extreme and risk contexts are filled by men. 60% of the most senior leadership roles are filled by international staff, and 75% of staff have a master's degree. I don't know how you feel about these statistics, but for me, these are actually depressing, but also in a way illuminating. And the main takeaway there that HAG has also emphasized is that we're not drawing on the diversity of voices and talents and experiences in the sector to the detriment of humanitarian effectiveness. And when in many ways, the sector's leadership should be the most diverse. We are operating in many different country contexts and have access to a broad range of potential staff. So we looked at to what or how diverse and inclusive leadership teams actually make a difference to make it more like to make it more practical and to really establish that evidence. And I hope it's okay to share this finding, which we are yet to publish, but what's really interesting here is that those organizations with diverse and inclusive leadership teams are able to better adapt and come up with solutions to difficult challenges in context. So what this means is that those leadership teams that are more diverse and inclusive are also operating in an organization where innovation is something that's embraced and really valued. And this is really very promising, because even though there's a lot of talk about diversity and inclusion, we now have this concrete evidence that came from a survey and key informant interviews and document reviews with our research partners in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Bangladesh to say that, hey, it actually works. It gives us these benefits, and what's actually kind of limiting us from really experiencing these benefits. So it was really clear that leadership is a lever for change, and in order to foster a more equitable humanitarian sector, I think we need leaders who can create conditions where new thinking can emerge for diverse voices to really be valued and to really be a priority, and for these good ideas not just to be good ideas but are actually implemented. So and also, just a last point, I think one of my reflections there as well is the diversity of voices also inform the way we imagine what an equitable humanitarian system look like. And I have this very striking quote from Arati Krishnan. She's a humanitarian futurist, and she said here, there are so many of us talking about like how do we change the humanitarian sector, but it's also very important that we are critical of whose vision it is that we are privileging in that reimagination. So that was really something that I keep thinking about until I'm listening to everyone's good points here in this discussion.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Pamela. And as you were talking, I was thinking about Chimamanda Adichie's the danger of one story. And I always use that to think the danger of one voice, the danger of one perspective, the danger of one thought, the danger of humanitarian sector looks like this, coming from one perspective, but actually the people who are experiencing the disaster are not part of that voice. And so I think for me, that really excites me. And I think somebody in the chat said participatory approaches, absolutely, you know, and participatory approaches are about co-design. They're not about, we will invite you when we choose to invite you, but that we are part of this. We are sitting together, and that the power dynamics are really clearly, you know, put on the table, that actually this is about our life. Yes, you may support us with your dollars, but that does not give you the power over us. So I think there's a lot that's coming up. Rohan, I'd love for you to just sort of finish us off before we go to the Q&A, where I know lots of people have more questions, but really, you know, pulling on the point that Pamela just raised around, you know, what needs to start to happen. She's mentioned leadership. How can international actors start to shift their practice? You know, do we throw it all away and start again so that we can support equitable humanitarian systems? Do we start to bring in certain leaders that come from here? Is the whole system broken? Like, what are we thinking? Where to next? I'd love, you know, it's a big question. I'll ask all of you to contribute to it, but Rohan, you're starting with that. You're starting us off.
So I remember my first day of international development studies at ANU as a year one, and the first question the lecturer said was, where are all the HQs for all the agencies located? And we all sat there and we just, you know, they're in the UK, the US, you know, and it said, why are they located there? They're not located in, you know, these countries that we're supposedly meant to be serving and supporting. There are country offices there, and then there's field offices there. I'll use that word again, hopefully more in context. But, you know, we have this architecture which is very top down still. So I think, you know, part of the question is, how do we shift it? We have to know, are we trying to shift the sector, or are we trying to shift ourselves, really? You know, are we, you know, continually just sort of being part of the issue, but being part of the problem? I mean, there's options here. I mean, we have a UN cluster system, which is a siloed, supply-driven situation. So, you know, sitting in a cluster meeting many times, it's very mandated, focused. It's very scripted. But it hasn't really evolved. So, and we see often the same faces there. We have 11 sectors in the cluster system, as you probably all know. Should we be evolving the system to include an environmental and resource management sector or cluster, which would be probably a key highlight in the Pacific, you know, around resource management and climate change? Should we be having a cash transfer cluster that doesn't just mandate the use of vouchers, but the true cash transfer process? You know, these are the sort of macro level questions I think we can look at. But shifting to a more equitable sort of system, I still think it's really up to us, and it's up to us around such things as you know, there's structural racism and there's structural discrimination in agencies, but there's also subconscious bias or our own sort of unconscious bias, sorry, not subconscious. And I think this is what we bring as an expatriate to the grounds where we're working, the grounds where we're working. It also, we bring it back again. We have this in gender bias, name bias, age bias. And I think one of the key elements that sort of unconscious bias is having in the sector is that it affects us personally, but it affects the recruitment, it affects our programming focus, it affects who we partner with and who we trust. So to give you an example, in Iraq, when we were setting up a very large program there, we didn't really reach out to local agencies. because we said, oh, you know, and I made the call. I said, well, it's strategic to go with these other agencies who are international, and they are trusted and they have the systems in place, and we will subcontract to the local partners that we find them. So, yeah, I was part of the problem, absolutely, 100%. And I'll call myself on that after looking back. But I think, you know, what the sector really needs to understand is, how do we assess our own our unconscious bias throughout our life cycle in the sector? And, you know, the implicit associate test, I think by Harvard, or you know, I think it's a Yale, Washington University implicit association test is one way we can look at it as a micro sort of approach. But we still need to go into the situation with open eyes. And I've been guilty of not doing that because of what, you know, Bethia was saying around, we're expected to do X, Y, and Z. We're expected to fit into a package there, and we're expected to spit it out at the other end, and everything's going to be okay. So I might stop there. I won't implicate any agencies. You can probably work it out.
We're working very hard, Rohan, to not implicate anyone. This is not why we're here, so I appreciate that. But if it slips, it's okay. We'll forgive you. Bethia, Suman, let's start with Suman and then we'll get to Bethia. But I'd like to hear from you, you know, just continuing on the conversations we've been having now in terms of how can we start to shift this practice? We've heard partnerships, we need to rethink that. We've had leadership, we're talking about restructures, we're talking about, in some cases, just throw it in the bin and start again. Suman, give us, you know, very briefly, 1 or 2 points you think we can add to this conversation around where to next. How do we start to shift this practice? Suman, I think you're on mute, sorry.
Okay, sorry. So thank you, Christiana. So I think it's actually the whole sector who are working in this humanitarian are thinking around those issues. And particularly after this summit, humanitarian summit, it's become more prominent in the discussion, and people are still discussing, and made some improvement, I would say, and one of which is like this humanitarian program cycle that's been introduced by the UNHCR in 2016 or 17, I think. And the basic difference of humanitarian program cycle and the kind of the normal program cycle management is humanitarian program cycle introduced the planning of a response based on the strategic objective instead of setting its very target oriented. And to me, I think that is a good start of improving the more equitable sector. Yes, while the humanitarian contexts are continuously changing, so we cannot set the target in stone. But again, although this HCP, humanitarian program cycle, been introduced, and UN are to some extent practicing it, but the rest of this of the actors, for example, local NGOs, international NGOs, are very much still on the log frame, stacking on the log frame and the target things. And they have very little flexibility as a manager or as a leader making the changes on the ground. So when we discuss how we can make it more equitable, I think, and that's where actually this could be a good start, that if we can take this humanitarian program cycle approach for every actors in terms of implementing activities on the ground, and for that implementation definitely we need leadership level people who can decide on the strategic issues on the ground. So that could bring some benefit, number one. And number two, when we discuss, yes, again, recognizing localization could be one of the game changer on the sector. But localization, when we discuss humanitarian localization, it seems like it is the agenda for the humanitarian directors only. Whether it should be a organizational change management process. When we discuss localization, when we discuss the change, definitely it relates to the contract, procurement, partnership, everyone, finance, everyone on the sector. But still, people are just is pressuring, or to say pressuring, but discussing the humanitarian localization, part of the humanitarian director's responsibility, and no initiative on the change management of an organization. So, if and still people are very much in debate with those ideas even.
Yeah, they are. It's an ongoing debate, Suman.
Debate on the ideas even.
Yeah.
So I think as a super high level political discussion, those issues came in, and taking that on the ground. I'm not saying that tomorrow it will be changed. This will be changing, but our discussion, continued discussion based on the experience, we can take those in a good track.
Yeah, thank you very much, Suman, for that. Now, Bethia, definitely last but by no means least, this is a conversation that started with Pamela when she started to talk about, what needs to be done, some of the things that we're thinking, and you've heard a whole raft of things. I'd love to hear from you. And again, of course, the question is really, how can, international actors start to shift their practice if we are being serious about equitable sort of systems, whether aid, humanitarian? What does that look like from where you're sitting?
Thanks, Chrisanta. And I wish so much that we could just have this conversation in real life, because I would love to hear what all the students are thinking. And please keep chatting, because I'm loving what you're saying about, being radical and like all of these, I think number one, like fresh perspectives that aren't jaded. I think one of the biggest things that was a barrier to my experience in the sector was that jadedness that you come up with, and this is just how things get done. So you shift the goalposts, and I think that I'll try to be brief. I will try keep things short. But some of the things I'd say is to stop shifting the goalposts and start shifting how we see our individual impacts, so our organization's impacts within a much more like be naive, be like think big and have big goals, and don't be like worried that, oh, this isn't how things are done now. How things are done now isn't how things have been done before, and it isn't how things will be done in the future. And if you can be really leading that change and seeing seeing effective results from it, like that's the only way that change happens. So I think also sometimes we can think, oh, we're like, we have to change the world, and we can get really bogged down when we're not seeing change, and we're not seeing the kind of big change that we, want to be a part of. And I think remembering that most people who've been really, big thinkers and really impressionable on all of us in all of our work have never lived to see the kind of world that they wanted. And we may not, but that doesn't stop us from working towards it. And I think reframing aid as well, I know we talked a lot about language, and I think language is important. We obviously need to go beyond talking about the language of it. But if we're thinking about what can we do to make someone else's life better, I feel like there's a problem in that, because we're not, I think a better way of looking at it is what can we do to make the world, to be building a world that we want to be a part of, and to be seeing ourselves not as these, like puppet masters, or even, outsiders looking at a problem. We're all part of the problem, and we're all part of the solution. And we all have different, levels of resourcing and skills that that we bring to that. And I think rather than saying, we need to let local people do it, so we're going to step back. We really need to also be brave enough to give up our resources and give up our space and our voices, rather than just handballing the problem, because that's an easy way to see it. So I also just wanted to, I was glad you mentioned it, Rohan, about unconscious bias, because I think it's a really interesting, and I'd love to hear what other people think about that term, because to me, the term unconscious bias is, again, one of those things that allows us to claim innocence. It allows us to say, oh, we're not aware that what we're doing is wrong. It's all going on underneath the surface. But what I see it as is socially conditioned or structural or bias that's reinforced. We're rewarded for acting that way, because that's something that we are, too afraid to talk about a lot. And I think it's really important to have those conversations and do meaningful actions out of them, rather than, trying to start from a place of we are good, trying to start from a place of we can be better. I just thought I'd raise that one point. And then the last thing I'll say is, we've talked a lot about professionalisation and silos, and I think those are really important conversations to keep having about how do we de-silo things, and what does a professionalised response actually mean, and who is instituting or enforcing what a professionalised response is. And I think to some degree, I'd say deprofessionalisation is, especially in aid, maybe not so much in a humanitarian fast response situation, but when you're looking at long-term development needs for a community, when it's professionalised, it becomes seen as something that's outside of the lived experiences and the community that's being made for. And I think so many of the people I work with, that all of the amazing knowledge that they have, and I wouldn't just call it local knowledge. I think another problem is when we call our knowledge expert knowledge or international knowledge, and we have local knowledge that is only good for that local experience. We need to be building, connections between, groups, not just from global north to global south, but across the global south, where that knowledge is not just local. It's got utility, huge utility across, whether it's Indigenous groups working on land rights issues and water, resourcing, and all of these kinds of issues that I think need to be built more solidly into what we're talking about when we talk about the aid sector. And I think when we talk about not being political, that's, I think, being really critical of who we are, what we're saying when we say that we're not being political, because everything that we do when it involves money and involves people's livelihoods, and there's inequity there, is political. And to, a lot of what's happening in Myanmar at the moment, a lot of what happens around the world in different crises gets really constrained by that idea of neutrality or not being political or not funding, self-defense of, a group. And I think that comes back to the innocence and not wanting to have get blood on our hands. And, I think there's a lot in there. I'll stop because I want to hear the question. But yeah, that's my little bit.
Amazing. You've totally captured most of what I was going to say, so I'm not going to repeat most of it, but something that really continues to challenge me as a practitioner, as an academic in international development, is this notion of who is making the decision about what the sector should be. Who is making the decision about what knowledge is relevant and what knowledge is local, so to speak? Who is making those decisions, and how are those decisions then translating into so-called change and impact from a development perspective. So I think for me, there's a lot, obviously, like you said, to unpack, and I could get into a rant, and I don't want to go there because I know we're running out of time. But for me, there's a lot for us to start to ask. The change has to start with us. We endorse the systems, we endorse the structures, we endorse the politics. We are the people that endorse this. We talk about politics like it's over there. We are the ones who support this. So there's a shift in terms of how we as a community, as a society, need to start pivot our thinking from that which we have been taught is the norm from one perspective, and start to really look at all the perspectives because they are valid and they are important. And it's the only way that we are going to get to some sort of change, whether it's in development or in the humanitarian sector. I don't want to keep people longer than I have to. I thank you profusely for being part of this as the panelists. You've made my work so easy. I would love to hand over to Beth now to finish off.
Thank you so much, Chrisanta. Mind is totally blown. This is an area that I'm passionate and interested about, but I realize just how little I really know about it after tonight. So thank you so much for sharing so generously of your experiences and your insights. It was absolutely fantastic. And thank you for everyone for making the chat just go off. Like I don't see that in many events, and I just love how engaged you all were. So I would just say to the wonderful students, you can't say you didn't know. You've heard it here tonight. You have a chance to be part of change, of being the generation of people who listen and who make change. So I want to give a huge thank you to Chrisanta and our panelists tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. We have recorded this event and we will have it on our YouTube